All right, welcome to the Mental Health Toolbox. I'm Patrick, your host, and today we have a special treat for you. We are talking with Dr. Mike Caparrelli, doctor in behavioral science, and who is a former pastor and speaks around 18 states in the country on criminal psychology, behavioral science, mental health. And so he's our expert today, and he has had the privilege of interviewing a American serial killer known as the Son of Sam. He has spent over 100 hours with the Son of Sam, David Berkowitz, and wrote a book about it and his experience, and is bringing to us today some insights on how we can think about human behavior in maybe a different way and maybe find some levers we can pull in society in order to prevent future tragedies by attending to the root issues of some of these individuals before they act out. So, this is going to be a great conversation. Please join in the conversation with any questions you have. If you're joining us from Facebook, be sure to go to streamyard.com/Facebook if you want your comments to be seen. And if you're over on Instagram, just keep in mind there is about a 20 or 30-second delay. Best place to watch is, of course, YouTube. But without further ado, let's meet Dr. Caparrelli. Hey, doctor, thank you so much for joining us today. Really appreciate you making time to share your insights and the wonderful work you are doing.
Patrick, thank you for having me on. It's a pleasure to be here.
Great to have you. So you recently put out a book just to kind of get everyone up to speed. It is called Monster Mirror, and it is your labor of love and the time you spent with David Berkowitz, and you share the insights there. Can you tell us a little bit about what the premise of your book is for those who aren't familiar?
Sure. The book was released in October on Amazon. It actually ranked the #1 in the true crime category, I want to say about 4 or 5 days in a row in October when it was released. It's my sit down with David Berkowitz. I sat with him for 34 sessions, 100 hours. David Berkowitz is also known as the Son of Sam. He's an inmate at Shawangunk Correctional Facility in Wallkill, New York. He's been incarcerated for 46 years. Back in the 1970s, he had gunned down 13 people in the city of New York. For about a period of a year and 3 or 4 months, he taunted the media. He left catch me if you can letters at every crime scene. And he had the entire city spellbound by fear. In addition to the shootings, he also lit 1,400 fires, really had a mental breakdown, not only a personal breakdown, but the cumulative nervous breakdown of a city. And I sat with David for 100 hours to discuss some of the mental health factors behind his crimes, some of the psychological reasons, as well as some of the spiritual influences. We also talked about his journey over the last 35 years since he became a Christian in 1988, and what we call his journey of redemption. And that story is featured in the book Monster Mirror.
Wow, thank you so much for the work you've done. And 100 hours for anyone who's been a therapist who's watching. We have a lot of therapists in our audience. I'd say that probably makes up the majority of our audience. It's no small thing to clock 100 hours. And when you say 34 sessions, in my head, I'm already translating that as like at least 2.5 hours per session. And if anybody who's been in a prison, especially a max security prison, knows it's not like you can just waltz in the door with your court order, that you can visit this person. There's a whole process to it. You have to get clearance. Sometimes there's red tape. Sometimes there's a lockdown, and it takes time just to get in the room with someone, right?
True.
And so that's no small feat. I imagine this took several years to accomplish all those interviews.
Yeah, it began with me writing David Berkowitz a letter in 2021. I had mailed him a copy of my prior book, a book on mental health from a biblical or Christian perspective. I knew David was a Christian. I'd heard his story on a few different talk shows. I had a heart for prisoners from the time I was young. I used to visit my dad in prison when I was about 9 or 10 years old. In Italian-American families, when dad goes to prison, the euphemism is school. So my mother used to say, we're going to see dad in college. And so I had a compassion for people in prison at a young age. And then at 17, I was incarcerated as a juvenile in a juvenile detention center. I was a troubled teenager. It's actually where I came to faith in Christ, and my whole life turned around at 18. So I had this predisposition towards prisoners. Mailed David a book, figuring it would encourage him, and he wrote me back in 2021, telling me he'd love me to visit him, that I was the kind of guy that could tell his story, being the fact that I was a Christian, as well as having an understanding of the human psyche and the breakdown of the psyche. And I met David early in 2022, and we met for a period of 15 or 16 months, about twice a month.
Wow.
In the 34 sessions.
Wow. So you were the one to reach out and he responded. Did you get any pushback from him? Was it a process of getting him to agree for you to come meet with him, or was he pretty open from the beginning?
No, he was open right away. I mean, he read my book, so he knew my worldview. He knew where I was coming from, and it was kindred to his own worldview. He was very inspired by the book. Plus, we had some mutual friends, other ministers that I know that have ministered to him, so that kind of paved the way. And that first visit, it was actually during COVID, 2022. I mean, well, it depends upon how you define COVID, but the prison was under COVID regulations. So we did have to wear masks for those first, I want to say, 3 or 4 visits. It was a process of building a rapport. I mean, initially he wasn't as open as he became as we developed trust. But I'll tell you, by the end of the meetings with him, I think he ended up unveiling a lot more about himself than he ever planned. I mean, he certainly told me things that he had never told anybody. Sitting with him that long, you develop a friendship. In fact, I still see David, probably visit him once every 5 or 6 weeks now. I'll visit him this coming Saturday.
That's wonderful.
We live about maybe 3 hours. I live about 3 hours from the prison. So, my heart is for the inmate. Not that I believe he should be released. I mean, if he ever was released, he does go for parole every 2 years. I would certainly support him. But, he's not chomping at the bit for that. He has accepted the fact that after 46 years of being in prison, that he can probably make the biggest difference in society and for the cause of the faith where he is than on the outside.
Yeah. Well, it begs the question. So obviously that's the most recent endeavors. What led you into this? And I think you've hinted at this a little bit, but what led you into the field of behavioral science, given that you were a pastor and that was a huge part of your life? Why behavioral science?
Well, I pastored for 16 years, a church in Rhode Island, about an hour from Boston, about 2 hours and 20 minutes from New York City. It was a pretty urban church. People from all different walks of life, mental health problems, addictions. We had a very active 12-step meeting that would meet on Tuesday nights, and inmates that were actually released from the prison and help facilitate their reentry into society. So 16 years of being on the front lines, lots of exposure to dysfunction of all sorts. I wanted a better understanding of, what makes people tick. So in the process of pastoring, throughout that 16 years, I pursued higher education, first the bachelor's, then the master's, and then eventually the PhD, 12 and a half years of full-time college. So I think it was my direct experiences with people, going all the way back to my dad and my own broken family, throughout my years of ministry, that gave me a greater desire to understand the human psyche.
Wow. Yeah, now that's no small feat. I mean, if anybody, pastoring in it of itself is you're putting a lot of energy out, right? You're present with the people, with your congregation. It can be exhausting, as I'm sure.
I actually suffered 2 heart attacks from the stress of it. I had a small heart attack at 40.
Wow.
And 2 years later, I had the widowmaker, which kills 83% of the people at 42. So pastoring took its toll. I resigned from pastoring in 2019 when the PhD was complete. I actually began my dissertation, my research in 2019. I completed the 4 years of coursework and spent 2 years doing my research from 19 to 2021. And in the process, wrote 5 books on mental health from a Christian perspective. Monster Mare is my 5th book. And doors started opening in churches, schools, prisons. And I speak around the country on mental health because of my education and my experience.
Like that was one of the wasn't that one of if I recall one of your interviews you had mentioned you sent your book Dr. Jesus to Berkowitz, and that was maybe
That's
one of
the
your touch points, right?
correct. Yeah, Dr. Jesus was a book written on mental health conditions such as depression, anxiety, PTSD, borderline personality disorder, and what the Bible has to say about
Mhm.
some of these disorders. Obviously, the Bible doesn't mention the disorders per se, but some of the substrates, some of the roots, the underlying causes of the disorder, the scriptures. What's the scriptures' take on these disorders? I wrote the book Dr. Jesus, and that's what David responded to.
What a fascinating intersection because we're, on the one hand you have the pastoral experience, you have the frame of reference of the canons of the Bible to give you context from a religious standpoint, but then you also have your PhD in behavioral science, and then you're looking at maybe from a different lens, but there's some intersection where you've been able to see some maybe where they're not at conflict, right? Sometimes when we look at the Bible, we think some people argue, well, the Old Testament contradicts the New Testament, not necessarily if you understand the entire context, right?
Well,
I
the
has that
Bible.
been your
I'm
go
sorry.
ahead?
No, the Bible is not only a book of theology, telling us about the character of God, but it's also a book of psychology. I mean, it's full
Mm,
of narrative, and the narrative shows us the human struggle. And human beings have not changed in the last several thousand years. It might be different dress and different lingo, but
mhm,
the heart of man is still the same. The Bible, not only do I read it, it reads me.
mm.
It really is one of the greatest psychology textbooks around. So when you read the Bible and you understand the science, and when they blend together, it's quite insightful.
I can imagine, absolutely, but I also think about faith, and we look at some of the horrors in society, and one of the things we hear oftentimes from people who are struggling with their faith, or even, even if your faith is really strong, I think we're only human. We look at things like tragedies, like cancer, and then you take that a degree further, right, to serial killers and murder. Um, how does one reconcile their faith? How did you reconcile your faith with this part of society, right? This dark part of society where it says if there's a God, how can these things be, right?
Well, the Bible is not a book of blind optimism, and it doesn't
Hmm.
propose some type of utopian worldview. I mean, the Bible's very realistic on its
Hmm.
depiction of people, of life. I mean, Jesus said, "In this world, you'll have trouble." The darkest parts of who we are on blast in the Bible. So, when I have my Bible in one hand and the reality of life in the other, they reconcile
Hmm.
pretty well because the Bible's not denying the
Ah.
darkest side of reality. It's
Hmm.
actually helping give context to it. It's helping put in perspective, why we do what we do. And really, its fundamental answer is that we are born with a sinful nature. We like to think that we're wonderful people. It's one of the presuppositions of my book, Monster Mirror.
Hmm.
I call it Monster Mirror because I was expecting to look at a monster when I seen David. Instead, I saw a mirror, and I realized that the line between the so-called psychopath in the general population is a lot thinner than we want to imagine. We like to
Mm.
think that serial killers are other people, school shooters are other people, mass murderers are other people. There are no other people. There's just
Ah.
people. It's human nature. And within human nature is a potential for both great good and horrific evil. So the Bible's very realistic about that. It gives us an accurate depiction of what mankind is capable of.
Yeah.
Our modern day humanism would say you're wonderful. People like David Berkowitz are anomalous, some kind of
Hmm.
freak of nature. The Bible
Hmm.
says no. The potential to kill really is in everyone, and probably law and order is what keeps most people at bay. So, I believe, coming from a Christian Judeo worldview, a much more realistic perspective of mankind than the delusions of humanism.
Well, yeah, from a biblical standpoint, the heart is deceitful above all things and wicked, right? Meaning that rather than the maybe natural law, we look at philosophy like John Locke would say, the natural law is that, we're all mostly well intentioned and we look out for each other, and, we try not to step on each other's toes. But if we're isolated, right? You look at animals, right? When animals are isolated, or when there's a lack of resources, right? Then you see that behavior come out, that guarding behavior. You can see that the dogs and their toys or food, right? Sometimes they'll growl and they won't want to give something up. And I think that the more scarcity in our mindset there is, the more these behaviors are likely to take place. Yeah.
Yeah, you mentioned isolation. It's one of the themes that we explored, David and I, when talking about what was behind his crimes, because that's one of the questions I ask in the book.
Mm-hmm.
It's, David, what drove you to senseless violence? In one of those factors, I list 9 in the book. There are 9 chapters, each chapter exploring one of the underlying causes of David's madness. One
Mm-hmm.
of them is isolation. David was a very isolated individual, and we know that isolation causes one to become aggressive. University of Japan has done studies on rodents and have taken lab rats, taken a sample of lab rats, isolated them for a period of time, and when they return the isolated rodents back to the community, the point of reentry, the isolated rodents attack their community, because when we're isolated, we get aggressive. Cortisol goes up, adrenaline goes up, and we become less empathetic. Oxytocin drops. Our ability to empathize with people declines while our aggression goes up. So David Berkowitz was one of those isolated individuals. In fact, if you look at most mass shooters, school shooters, you'll see that the outsider mentality is one of the common denominators. David says that in his letter to the NYPD when he was doing the killings in the 70s. He says verbatim, "I am an outsider programmed to kill, watching the world go by." Now, am I saying isolation is going to cause someone to become a serial killer? No. I mean, there's 9 ingredients that make up the recipe that I discuss in the book. I don't think that you're going to just go out tomorrow and, start gunning people down, but it is a process. And I'll tell you what, if you spend enough time pulling away from community, brooding over your resentments, because resentment is another one of those ingredients, brooding over your resentments, isolating, justifying every wrongdoing you commit, you'll be surprised at the kind of person you evolve into. A serial killer is not a sudden thing. It's more subtle than sudden. But I discussed that subtle process, that trajectory from childhood all the way up into his early 20s within the book Monster Mirror.
Absolutely. When we're looking at forensic psychology and profiling, I think we're all familiar with some of the quote early warning signs like fire setting, bedwetting, torturing animals, right? Anybody in the clinical space. We've heard these things. In fact, they're on many mental health triage forms, right? When we're even assessing somebody for treatment, because these are some of the contributing factors, right? To, whatever you want to call it, psychopathy or social deviance or conduct disorder or antisocial personality disorder. But were you surprised when you met with Berkowitz that isolation was a factor? Or were you kind of like, oh yeah, I figured that makes sense?
Well, I wasn't surprised that isolation was a factor, but the particular kind of isolation to me was insightful. David Berkowitz, I want you to think about this. He grew up in the most populated city in America. He's not the Unabomber. He's not Ted Kaczynski in a hermit in a cabin isolated from society. He plays on baseball teams when he's a kid. He's a part of the Appalachian Mountain Club when he's an adolescent. He's in the military for 3 years, lots of comrades. He's around people all the time. But there's a difference between being with people and bonding with people. The kind of isolation that David experienced, he was not the loner in the corner. He was the loner in the crowd. And we explored what it is that causes one to feel separated, lonely, even when surrounded by people. So I think the reader of the book is going to understand that. They're going to relate to it because there's a lot of people out there. You can imagine a Travis Bickle, the movie Taxi Driver back in the 1970s, surrounded by people. Even his career, he's constantly got people in the taxi cab, but yet still has this outsider mentality. So the particular kind of isolation to me is what was very insightful. But the idea of it being isolation, that was already evident in studying other mass murderers, other school shooters, and other serial killers.
I don't want to drive past that too much because I feel like that is something that we talk about, but it's easy to kind of forget. right? That we can be surrounded by 100 people, but still feel alone. What do you think? Because that's one layer, right? But what do you think contributes to someone feeling alone in today's society? Even someplace like New York City. Is it like a rejection sensitive dysphoria? Is that built into someone, or do you think that is fostered?
Yeah, I think it's more fostered. I mean, I'm a proponent of attachment theory. I think that
Mhm.
David, in his early years, had developed an attachment style. He was adopted. By the way, serial killers are 16 times more likely to be adopted than the general population. Not saying adoption causes serial killing. I mean, there are far more people that are adopted that are not serial killers.
Right,
Let's keep
right.
in mind that serial killers are a rare specimen. They're not everyday people.
Mhm,
But what is common amongst adoptees often is a reactive attachment disorder, some
mm,
kind of attachment style, a way of relating to the world that begins at an early age, probably at the moment of separation from the biological life giver. There's a bond disruption, and
mhm,
we don't quite understand that. I mean, there have been books written on the subject. One of them is called Primal Wounds, and how that bond disruption can affect one's ability to trust. I mean, David Berkowitz's adopted parents were good people, but they say in their own words when they were alive that loving him was very difficult from the very beginning. It was like
mm,
trying to stick a piece of tape on a wet surface. The
mm,
affections wouldn't stick. So David, had a problem with trusting from a young age. So his ability to know and be known, because that's what relationships are about. Intimacy is
mhm, mhm.
willingness to know.
Vulnerability, right.
Yeah, vulnerability, to be vulnerable, to
Yeah,
know and to be known. That vulnerability, although he had a lot of friends, it just wasn't present. He kept a lot of secrets. He had a lot of sidekicks, but he had more secrets than sidekicks. And it kept him feeling separated, even in a crowd. I mean, your secrets will create great distance between you and the people around you.
that's fascinating. We think about, adoption, I think about foster care, right? 'Cause foster care, oftentimes, people are put into foster care for a reason. People don't
Mm,
generally just give up their children unless, I mean, there's everybody has their reasons, but more often than not, children are removed from care, right,
mm.
and placed into foster, and people adopt through foster care. So it makes me wonder if, maybe trauma plays a part as well. Did he talk about, I mean, obviously, depending on what age you're adopted, but I'm wondering if there's any recollection of trauma from his family of origin.
Well, it doesn't have to be the family of origin. It can
Mm,
be, like in his case, happen in the school system.
mm,
Uh, well, let me back up and say this: when you're trying to explain human behavior, you make what's known as an attribution. You're,
mhm,
you're, you're explaining the cause of behavior. There are two kinds of attributions. There are dispositional attributions, which means the cause of behavior comes from within. The mental health community seems to focus a lot on dispositional attributions, like if someone has
mm,
a chemical imbalance, they need medication. But then there are
mm,
situational attributions, and that's what's happening within the circumstance and the power of a situation and what it can do to someone.
mhm,
I mean, it's just is understated in my opinion. And looking back at David's situations throughout childhood, the school was a place of great shame. This is 1950s New York City. David's
mhm,
a very hyperactive kid. ADHD was not understood at that particular time. His teachers would often put his desk in the center of the classroom. They'd create a circle of desks, and David was at the center along with another student or two. And the teacher would say, "This is where the bad boys sit."
oh,
For
wow.
David, going to class every day was very stressful. He would actually fake sick continually just to avoid
Mm.
the stress of going to school.
The
Um,
shame.
the lots of shame,
Yeah.
also experiences with bullying. He was overweight. He was also bullied by his own uncle, his adopted father's brother, who would body shame him, often call him fat. He was a Jewish kid growing up in an Italian American neighborhood. He was picked on a
Mm,
lot by some Italian neighbors for being Jewish. So he had
mm.
lots of experience of
For
shame,
prejudice, shame.
prejudice, yeah, prejudice, shame, body shaming, all that. In addition to the situation with the adoption, that definitely contributed to his resentment.
Mhm. Sounds like a theme of rejection.
big
Even though
time.
he had love from his parents, there's still there was still he was taking blows in other parts
Yep.
of his life, big blows, sounds like, which didn't help his trust issues, I'm sure.
No. I mean, you think about rejection from an evolutionary standpoint. Evolutionary psychology, the idea that we have a primitive brain. I'm not a Darwinist. I don't believe we come out of animals. I mean, some might
Mhm,
believe that. That's fine. But I do believe that there's some truth to evolution. The idea that we have a primitive brain, a limbic system that predates, our current conditions, that goes all the way
mhm,
back to tribal times.
mhm.
And if you weren't a part of a tribe, if you were ousted from that tribe, if you were rejected in some way, that rejection meant you were unsafe. It meant
Probably
you
wouldn't
were,
survive, right?
yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. You were in danger. So the idea of being rejected, it's more than an emotional blow. It's an attack on our physiological nature. It kicks into gear our survival instincts. We're in fight flight mode now. Rejection equals major stress because our tribal makeup, knows that we're only safe in a tribe and we're at danger outside that tribe.
Hmm. So what does one do? Like in, David's case, did he say how he coped with that? Were there any interventions? Were there
Well,
any
at a
support
young
offered to
age, it
him?
starts with
Yeah,
setting for him.
yeah.
I mean, he lit by the time he was arrested in 1977, he lit 1,400 fires. The fire starting began around 6 or 7.
Hmm,
Light bugs on fire, light toys on fire on his windowsill. Now,
mhm,
FBI in all their interviews with arsonists have have discovered that usually there's one or two reasons why people set fires. Either A, they're experiencing some kind of sexual orgasm, or
mhm.
B, it's some type of venting or release of pent up
Anger.
anger. In David's
Yeah,
case, it was B. He
mhm,
started expressing his anger at a very young age by lighting bugs on fire, toys, and then eventually property. If you study the history of the South Bronx, the Bronx
mhm,
was experiencing constant fires all through the 60s and 70s. In fact, the NYPD were looking for a serial arsonist um, by the name eludes me, but David Berkowitz was that serial arsonist. He
hmm.
would actually call the NYPD after lighting a fire and tell them, exactly where the fire was lit. He would log it in his diary,
Wow.
and the NYPD would later on find out that the same one that was gunning people down was the same one lighting fires. So it began for him with fire setting, as well as a host of other, you know, uh, forms of vandalism and, ways of venting his anger. He was a very angry kid. He was a ticking time bomb.
So we often talk about evil, right? Manifestations of evil, and we think about obviously serial killers. We there's a shadow of evil, or like you said, some preconceived notions around them. We see them in a static vertical, right? As they are, what they did. But as we're talking about this, I'm wondering, if there were a lot of warning signs, there were probably a lot of points of intervention. Do you think evil is evil, or do you feel like sometimes it's death by a thousand cuts when it comes to behavior change, psychological damage in this sense?
Yeah, well, I believe in evil as an objective reality,
Hmm.
just as I believe in God as an objective reality. I believe that evil and good, God and Satan, are supernatural beings, but they interact with natural phenomenon. So, one can be under the influence of either or, depending
Hmm.
upon one's choices. And David Berkowitz, at a young age, interacted with the wrong side. In fact, he believes that he was under the influence of demons when he committed the crimes, and I don't doubt him. Now, that's not
Hmm.
at the expense of human responsibility. It's
Right.
like saying if one is drunk and they commit a crime that they're not responsible. No, you made a choice consciously to put the substance in your body, and the
Hmm.
substance was probably, by the way, a truth serum, which
Hmm.
unleashed what was suppressed on the inside. We know that about alcohol. When people are
Right.
under the influence of alcohol, often what's on the inside is what comes out. So
Whole idea of
it's
losing your inhibitions, right?
yeah, it
Yeah.
loosens your moral inhibitions. Your compunctions
Hmm.
get weak, And in the case of David Berkowitz, he was under the influence of the demonic in his own words, but it was interacting with his inner resentments, his shame. Much of the violence was really an act of self-destruction. He was looking to not only kill other people, but he wanted to go out in a blaze of fire. His last ultimate act, he wanted to do a shooting in the Hamptons in Long Island at a club. He was going to die in a blaze of fire, going out by suicide by cop. So he believes he was under the influence of demons. Now that might sound horse and buggy to some listeners. Like, come on, that's like antiquated stuff. But 2/3 of the world still believe in demonic possession. And we as Americans can pride ourselves and say, well, we're more advanced than that. But guess what? We're leading the way with serial killings, child
School
pornography,
shootings,
human trafficking, school shootings. So who's more advanced, us or some village in Africa? Now, when I say the demonic, there are other serial killers that have also spoken of this. Ted Bundy, when he sat down with 2 FBI agents for 150 hours, he called it the X factor. He said that there was something outside of himself, an entity is actually the word he used. He called it an entity that would possess him, not at the expense of free will. But we use this language every day when we do things that are unbecoming of our character. If we kick a cat, we punch a wall, we lose our cool, we'll say things like, I'm sorry, I don't know what got into me. I'm sorry, I don't know what possessed me. I'm sorry, I got carried away. So right there in our language, we're insinuating some paranormal reality that whips up our emotions into a state of frenzy that takes us further than we ever planned on going.
Right. And so much so we can be taken aback by our own actions, right? Because they're what we would not identify with as our own character, right?
True.
Yeah. All that to say, the mind is a fragile thing.
Yes.
And we should be careful about what we ingest, be that alcohol, be that other influence, music. What we choose for our mental diet has an impact, whether we like it or not, is what I'm hearing.
Most definitely. I mean, David himself was a big fan of horror movies from a young age. In fact, the movie Taxi Driver, which I referenced earlier in the interview, played a role in his mindset when he was doing the killings. He'd seen Taxi Driver quite a few times in the movie theater. It came out the same summer he was doing the shootings. And the movie, he related to this outsider named Travis Bickle, who by the end of the movie, guns down a bunch of people, actually does it with the 44 caliber. It's what inspired David to go out and buy a 44 caliber. He took a road trip to Texas and bought it in Texas because he couldn't get a gun in New York. So yeah, when you say diet, the things we watch, some of the movies he'd watched at that time, and even some of the songs he was listening to played a role in his mindset.
Yeah, I know we touched on the idea of attachment styles earlier, and I know you said you're not an attachment theorist per se, but we're talking a lot about things like self-image, being rejection sensitive, shame, guilt, being excluded from the tribe, from society, right? The impact of a lot of these things, trauma. Do you feel like somebody who has a less secure attachment, right? Whether that's just, we call that self-esteem, or how they relate to society, how they feel they're accepted by society. Do you think the more distance there is from that sense of security, the more influential somebody is in general? I'm just curious what your thoughts are on that.
The more
Because it just came to me as we're talking about this in terms of being impressionable, right?
Oh, okay. So if someone, what you're asking is if someone is removed from the tribe, whether in reality or mentality, in their mind, they see themselves as an outsider, they become more impressionable to media influence.
I'm just wondering. I know because as we're talking about this,
I think you're onto something because, when we are removed from reality, we're prone towards fantasy. So if David is going to have any social connection and he's isolated, he's going to develop those social connections in an artificial kind of way. He relates to the character on the TV screen.
Absolutely. I know that's exactly what I was thinking when you mentioned that repetitively watching the movie again. That's sometimes what I think about, the fantasy. Right. And then sometimes when we can't when somebody kind of comes out of that fantasy and realizes they can't have what they want, sometimes that would make them angry and more likely to act
Absolutely.
out, resentful, right?
I mean,
We've heard the term wound collector, right? They
yes,
start taking up offenses, storing emotionally the offenses of senses of rejection and things like that. That could lead to a lot of pent up anger, right? When the fantasies don't cut it anymore, right?
most definitely. David was definitely a wound collector. He was one who took score. He made
Mhm.
very careful notes in his mind of wrongs committed against him by neighbors, by society at large, women. So from a young age, he was keeping score and he was looking to get even. Resentment was a big piece of this. I mentioned isolation, I mentioned shame,
Mhm.
but resentment is one of the bigger players of the story. And I think if really any one of us, if we go down that road of resentment, I mean, I'm just finishing Crime and Punishment by Fyodor Dostoevsky back in the 1800s,
Mhm.
and you got this, average Joe. I wouldn't call him a psycho, but he goes down this road of resentment towards society, resentment towards certain social classes, and you see how far it takes him and the monster he becomes. It's real easy for us to judge a serial killer and say, I would never do that, and such an awful person. But I would rather take the posture of a guy named John Bradford, who in the 1700s was watching a public execution, because back in
Mhm.
those days, when they would execute a man in London, it was a public act and the entire town is calling him names and what have you, and Bradford stands up tall and he says, but for the grace of God, so go I.
Mhm.
And that's my posture towards David Berkowitz. Is I look at him and I say, there but for the grace of God, so go I know what it
Mhm.
means to be resentful. I'm glad I didn't go down that path too far, because if I did, who knows what would have become of my own story.
Absolutely, and I think, coming full circle, that's absolutely the theme that I'm getting from the work as I understand it, that you've been doing. It's a reminder that, pride comes before a fall, and nobody is above making poor choices, given enough given enough damage, right?
Mm,
Enough distraction from our moral compass. When we start forgetting our why, and we
yes.
start, it's easy to start justifying poor decisions, right? I'm gonna get mine. I'm gonna get my piece of the pie. Everybody else does. Um, and that's like you said. That's I think it's a very natural inclination, right? Especially if we're in a negative space, right? I think you mentioned in one of your interviews something that really jumped out to me is that anger masks underlying emotions, right? That I think you said something along the lines of anger makes us feel powerful, but it might be masking a fear, might be masking another prime emotion, right? Could you just talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, that's not a new idea. That's really the Freudian perspective of anger, is that it's a
Mhm,
defense mechanism.
mhm,
Defense mechanisms, whether it be addiction, denial, or anger,
mhm,
block pain. And
yeah,
defense mechanisms, the goal of a defense mechanism is to make us feel powerful in a moment when we feel vulnerable. So anger in that way is a secondary emotion. It's a cover up emotion. And in David Berkowitz's case, it was a cover up for lots of shame. Um,
mhm,
I had a chance, I had the opportunity to see David Berkowitz very angry. One of the
mhm,
sessions, I showed up and he had some words with another inmate. It was more of a one-way conversation. The inmate said something very degrading, and I showed up like right after that situation. David was in bad headspace, and I got a chance for about 2.5 hours to watch a man manage his anger like a pro.
hmm,
Uh, it's one thing to have anger; it's another thing for anger to have you.
ah,
And I would say David had anger, but anger didn't have him. Typically, when people get angry, they externalize.
mhm,
It's all about people, places, things. They vent, they lament. They're always pointing the finger outward. The threat is outside of them. It takes great maturity to self-reflect while you're angry. That really is a hallmark of someone that's gone through great therapy. They've done some work, some real inner work. And David self-reflected. He peeled back the layers of the onion, and we talked about where that anger came from, and he told me about the shame. In fact, he told me about a therapist when he was a little kid, Mrs. Sosnoff. She was an older
Mm.
lady. She would ask him, David, why are you so angry? And he said he couldn't answer the question. He said, but now here I am in my 70s, and I know that it's shame, that when I feel embarrassed, I'd rather feel angry because anger makes me feel powerful. Shame makes me feel vulnerable. And I'd rather be powerful than vulnerable. And in
Mm.
that session, he became very vulnerable. And I think once you identify anger's source, you reduce its force. Once you get to what's underneath it, just identifying the initial feeling, the thing that you're running from, right away, it mitigates the anger. Because the anger is deceived in thinking the threat is from without. But the
Mhm.
moment you self-reflect, you realize that the real issue, the thing I'm really running from, is from within. And David was able to peel back the onion and expose what was underneath. And in this case, it was deep shame.
Wow. I love that. I love that because that is, I think even going back to what you were saying about our survival instincts, right? That we look for external threats,
Mm.
right? That's what fear is about. That's what anxiety is about, right? We're scanning for external threats.
Hmm.
But we live in a society now, for the most case, unless you live in certain areas, most most of us don't have external threats on a regular basis, right? And it's the inner work that needs to be done. And I wonder if that's why so many inmates find solace in faith, be that Christianity, be that other religions, because it gives them the tools. And sorry to say, but I don't think necessarily the mental health system is very robust as it should be in the prison system. They don't have access to therapists like they should. They don't have those readily available tools. What do they have? They have 12 step and they have religion to give them structure, to give them tools to help self regulate, as you said, that you saw firsthand with Berkowitz and how he was able to recalibrate himself without acting out, right?
Most definitely. What David found in prison, ironically, he couldn't find it in society.
Mhm.
He found his faith. He found a place of belonging. He meets with about 15 to 17 inmates twice a week for midweek Bible study and then a Sunday
Mhm.
morning service alongside a Korean chaplain. And he's a part of that community. He feels like an insider. In fact, they call him Pastor Dave. He blushes when they call him the
That's
title,
cool. Yeah.
but he's become a father figure. And that community and that walk of faith is really what has transformed his life over the last 35 years. Now, I know the skeptics will say, well, how do you know it's not a jailhouse conversion? Well, let me respond to that. Um, it's hard to fake a jailhouse conversion for 35 years.
Yeah.
Usually, jailhouse conversions last about 6 months, and it's right before a parole hearing to make an
Mm.
impression on the parole board. David's been very consistent about his faith. And when I say consistent, I mean involvement. I mean, he's invested in his faith for over 3.5 decades. That's not something you can fake that long. I've dealt with other serial killers. I dealt with two of them. And I learned pretty quickly that it was jailhouse religion and that they
Mhm.
were just using the talk and they really didn't have the sincere conversion that David experienced. So I know the difference.
Mhm.
Plus, I've seen David, not just his actions, but I've seen his reactions.
Mhm.
Actions, people can put on a good act. Shakespeare said that. He said the world is a stage and
Right.
people are its players. But reactions are actions when a man's caught off guard, when David's angry, he's stressed, things don't go his way. It's unscripted, it's visceral. And I would say that the reactions are the real fruit of someone's behavior. Because fruit, really, what is fruit? It's vegetation on a tree that's under
Right.
great pressure. And when a person behaves under pressure, that's the real fruit of who they are. And I've tasted David's fruit, and I would say it's good fruit.
Wow. That is so well put. And I don't think I've ever heard it put quite that way, right? If we want to see somebody's level of maturity is what we're talking about. Look at their reactions, not just their
Mm,
actions. That's
mm.
solid advice, and I'm gonna keep that one.
I give
That's
that.
good.
I got three daughters. They'll call me about
Yeah.
guys. They want to know if this guy that they're dating is the right guy, and I'm always telling them, slow down, watch him, watch how he behaves in a traffic jam, watch how
Mhm.
he behaves when things don't go his way, watch him on a stressful day at work. Spend enough time. Nothing can be trusted until it's been tested. And you can test it by paying attention to not just actions, but reactions over a period of time.
Right, good. And you've been had the privilege of being a fly on the wall with Berkowitz for quite a while. You've seen the longitudinal, you've seen him in different situations, and so that says a lot. Absolutely. And so I'm wondering, what would you hope that your readers get from this book? Like in terms of takeaways, what's the macro application, life application here in terms of our responsibility in society?
I think number one, you're going to walk away and you're going to do some self-reflecting. You're going to realize that you might not be a serial killer, probably are not a serial killer, but you do hold resentments, and you're going to find your story in David's story, and you're going to maybe surprisingly see yourself in some of his anecdotes of his background. So I think it's a soul searching book. Hence why I call it Monster Mirror. It really is a mirror. Secondarily, you're going to be less judgmental of people like David Berkowitz. We live in my opinion, we live in a very sanctimonious culture, cancel culture. I mean, if you look at social media, there seems to be a great deal of focus on people's Facebook posts or different things they write on social media. There's a great deal of focus on, observing other people, like intuitive sort of language, but not much introspection. A lot of intuition, perception of others, but not much introspection, perception of oneself. And I'd like to see that shift in our society. Maybe we go on Facebook and rather than blasting somebody else, whether we're blasting our narcissistic ex or we're blasting people at work, maybe there's a confession. Here's what I'm struggling with today. You don't see that much candor anymore. In our cancel culture, there's a lot of pointing the finger at everyone else. We've got a PhD in everybody else's issues, but we're in kindergarten when it comes to our own issues.
Isn't that the truth?
So I'd like to see that shift. I'd really like to see more self-reflection, more introspection, and less judging of other people in our culture. And I think we'd have a whole lot healthier of a society.
And so that would apply. So if we work on the self, then everybody wins.
Absolutely.
Right. Yeah. And what if we
look at the books on the shelf at Barnes and Noble? It's all about marrying a narcissist, or how to deal with the narcissist at work. I mean, where's the book about the narcissist inside of you? That book doesn't guarantee it.
I'm going to steal that title.
It's always the other person. It's always the other person. So
absolutely. And so that sounds like that's half the battle. What can we do as a society if we recognize some of these red flags in our youth, right? What is our responsibility as a society to firm up support for others that we see are in a vulnerable position, who are being pushed out of the tribe, who are being rejected, who are visibly dealing with shame rather than pathologizing their behaviors per se? How do we serve them to hopefully prevent future damage from things taking root? Do you have any thoughts on that and what we can do as a whole?
I do. I read a book last year by Susan Klebold. She's the mom of Dylan Klebold, the Columbine shooter. Excellent book. If you don't buy Monster Mirror, go on Amazon and buy her book. And she talks about her being a mother and looking back at Dylan's childhood. And she stresses the need for education at a young age that incorporates emotional intelligence. That we teach kids, we socialize kids better from a young age. We teach them how to get along with others, how to regulate their own emotions. I mean, if you look at the curriculum of public schools from the time kids in Head Start all the way to high school, of course, you've got your math and your social studies and your science and all this, and that's all important. But where is the emotional IQ aspect of education? There's not much of it there. So I think we could do a better job at cultivating empathy, socializing our kids at a younger age, teaching them self-reflection, anything to do with EQ, I think would go a long way in our society, especially in the era of social media, because our social skills are going to get weaker and weaker. Now, I think social media is a great supplement for relationships. It's a horrible substitute.
Right.
So if
Right.
you're using social media to supplement real life relationships, and you've got a good core of people that you meet with on a regular basis, and you can relate to these people, but if you're using social media as a substitute, and it's the only thing you have, that digital contact, and I can say a lot about that. That's a whole nother show. That
Sure.
digital connection is not the same thing as a real human connection. And I think that
Absolutely.
we need to teach relationships and teach empathy at a very young age.
And we can do that on so many levels, right? We can do that in the home. If a parent sees that their kid is spending more time on the screen than they are with real people, that's something they can be proactive about, right?
Mm, most
School
definitely.
district, the school districts can implement more programs that teach things like emotional intelligence and self-regulation and soft skills, which we know, like you said, far are greater indicators of success than is
Yes,
IQ,
most
right?
definitely. IQ
Yeah.
will not stand. I mean, people are fired from jobs not because of a lack of intelligence.
Hmm.
They're fired from jobs because they do not play well with others, so to speak.
Exactly.
So
Yeah.
that seems to be the real reason. Is it's a social issue, not an intelligence issue.
Right. Well, so much to digest here. I know I'll be rewatching and re-listening to this episode because there's just so many nuggets of wisdom about especially our role in society and how we can help serve those who are uh, being left behind in society to lift them up and help them have a better future, and that helps us all. And we start with, like you said, insight into ourselves and then how we can show up for other people, right?
Mm.
Pay attention, be looking for opportunities to be of service to others, right? Be that the 6-year-old who's lighting fires, be that to the grown-up who's isolated, right? At any level, we have opportunities if we pay attention, right? So, thank you so much, Doctor. I really am so glad you made it on today to share the work you're doing in this book and the implications to society and how we can do better. So, thank you for that. So, anyone who is interested in grabbing your book, they can do so right here at Amazon. You have it right here, Monster Mirror. And that is your most recent book, in addition to, you said, 4 or 5 other books you've put out. So,
Full
if anybody
million.
wants to binge read on the wonderful work you're doing, that would be fantastic. So, any last minute questions before we shut it down? Anybody before we land the plane? I think we're good. With that, I wish you a great week, Doctor, and you're always welcome back on to share the work you're doing.
Thank you, Patrick, for having me. You're doing a great work, brother. Keep shining.
Thank you. Likewise. Thank you.